Series of ES6. Today we will understand about var, let and const. So var, let and const, this is one of the most important and tricky concept that you should know. So let's start with the basics of var, let and const. Plus we will throw in some tricky interview questions that will make even the most seasoned developer break a sweat. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's jump right in. So let's start with the basics. So JavaScript has three different ways to declare variables: var, let and const, right? At first glance they might look very much similar, but trust me, there are some key differences that can trick you if you are not careful. So what's the difference? Now the difference boils down to three things: scoping, second is hoisting, and third is immutability or reassignment. So these are the three concepts around which all these three revolves around. If you understand three concepts based on the condition for var, let and const, then you can answer any of the interview questions. Okay, so let's start with the var. So var is the old traditional way to declare variables in JavaScript, and var has been around since the beginning, but it comes with a few tricks. Like for example, var is function scope, which means if you declare a variable inside a function, it cannot be accessed outside of it. But here is what it gets tricky. If you declare a var variable inside a block like an if statement, that variable is still accessible outside the block. So weird, right? And if you see, this can lead to bugs if you're not careful. Another thing to remember is hoisting. Variables declared with var are hoisted at the top of their scope, so you can actually use them before they are even declared. Let's go ahead and have a look at it with some examples. Now here is one example where I have declared var x equals to 10. Now what I said just 1 minute back was variable, if it is declared apart from inside a function anywhere else, is always global scope. Now in this case var x is global. Now if I console.log x, I will get the value of x equals to 10, and then here as well y equals to 10 into 10, which is 100. So that's the reason if you see, I will get 10 and 100 as output. This is a case where the scope of the variables as is declared within the var is a global. Okay, now let's see an example of local scope. Now let's comment this out and we'll see an example of local scope. Now if you see over here, this method, I have just written the method so that we don't waste time over here. So x equals to 10, right? And then I have done y equals to 10 into x, and I'm printing the y. Okay, now if I do console.log x, then it will throw me error because x is function scoped, right? Now I cannot access x beyond that function. That is the beauty or feature of var variables. Okay, now let's go ahead and see how we can redeclare and assign variables declared with var. Now if you go ahead and see another example, I'll just show you with examples because this will help you to remember you very easily. Okay, so now I have declared a variable x, and then I am again redeclaring it or reassigning it with x equals to 10. When I declared it, I didn't assign it anything. So then I am doing a console.log x, and then I'm printing x equals to 15, and then I'm again doing console.log x. So in this case, I am able to reinitialize the value, so not reinitialize, I am able to assign a new value to the variable var at any point of time, and I can do that. So that is even after declaring the first time with an initial value of undefined, because when you declare it, it's basically undefined. We assign a new value, and later on with the new value, we can it will still work. It will not throw you any error. So that's the second feature where we talk about immutability. So now let's go to the third example. I'm not showing the output because this is known, right? So let's go at the third example where we will see the hoisting concept in var, right? Now in var, variables declared with the var are hoisted at the top of their global or local scope, which makes them accessible before the line they are declared. Please keep it in mind, before the line they are declared. Now let's say in this case I am declaring y equals to 100, but I am accessing it before even declaring it. The compiler will not throw you any error, but when you run it, even if the value is assigned or some like it is there, but if it is hosted at the top, it will come with a value known as undefined. Okay, now when it comes with a value undefined, you multiply with 10, it gives you not a number. But that's not the problem. The problem is it still gets initialized with a, you can still access the variable y with some undefined value, which is the default one. Okay, now these are some of the problems with var which we discussed. It is in today's world, it's not advisable to use var in any of your modern JavaScript projects. Even if you want, you can use it, but as a developer, I will not suggest you to use var in any of your projects. So because first problem we saw, it gets even if you declare, someone else can use it again and again, and the value gets changed. You will not have any hint like where from which place and which area or which code has updated the variable, and you will not have a clue, and you will end up figuring out what happened exactly with that. So these are some of the examples with var. Now let's go ahead to the another way of declaring a variable, which is let. Introduced in ES6, let fixes some of the issues that var has. For example, let's say for beginners, let is always a block scoped, which means if you declare variables inside a block, it will stay inside that block. We'll explain this definition or with live example coming up in few minutes. Now this is a big improvement over var, because it prevents places where we do not used to know, like where the variables is getting leaked out of their intended scope or intended block. So let solves that problem. Now there are a few things based on which we'll have our discussions on let, var and const, which is primarily on the hoisting, on the scoping, and also on the assigning or reassigning the variables. Now let's go ahead and understand the scoping part, the global scope, local scope, and the block scope. Now variables declared outside any function or block is a global scope, as you know. So now in this example, if you see, this is a global scope. I have declared a global variable. Now this is a global scope, and inside this function I have a local scope because I have declared this variable inside the local block, right? Now what do you think will happen over here? Now this global variable is accessible in the entire scope of the execution, right? But this local variable is only accessible inside this method. If you see, this is the only method that is inside, and this based on this is accessible. Now if I try to access it over here, it is in the global scope, so global variable will work fine, but the local variables will not work fine, because if you try to do a console.log local variable, it will always throw you an uncaught or reference error, right? And if you try to console.log the blocked scope variable, in this block, if you see, there is a blocked scope. Now this blocked scope variable is not accessible outside of its block. Now this is the block where we have declared this block scope variable. Now this variable you cannot access outside this scope. So that's in pretty straightforward language, a simple example of global, local, and block scope for the let variables, right? Now how to redeclare and reassign variables declared with let. Now let's say I have a number. I'll just comment everything. You can ping me in the chat. I'll ping you this. Now let's say I have a variable let num equals to 100, right? And then I'm doing a console.log a number, right? And then what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to do num equals to 190, right? And then I'm doing console.log num. Now if you see here, what should be the output? Now let's see and try it first. Do you think it should get updated? Yes. So the num gets updated. Here we reassign this value of 100 to another to the same variable with updated value of 190. But there is a catch. Now if I try to do something like this again, now if you see during the writing the code, VS Code itself throws you an error, so you know, right, this is going to cause problems. So now it defines that number has already been identified or redeclared. So this is how the redeclaration or assignment of the variable works in case of let. Now how does the hosting works with the let? Now variables declared with let are hosted at the top of the global, local or block scope, but their hosting is different from the one that we have in var. Now var variables are hosted with a default value of undefined, which makes them accessible before their line of declaration, right, as we have seen in the previous video or the previous just the concept. Now but let variables are hosted without any default initialization. So this is one of the critical and important point which you have to remember is let variables are hosted without a default initialization. So when you try to access such variables, instead of getting undefined or a variable is not defined, you cannot access the variable before initialization. So now let's see with an example, with this same example where I'm trying to define the number. So now if I do console.log num, if you see over here, I just have a habit of giving semicolon, so don't worry about it. So if you see over here, reference error, cannot access num before initialization, right? If we declare variables, similar for the function declarations that we saw in the previous section. Now if we access it before the line of declaration again, we will get the cannot access number or before initialization reference error. These errors we will get in case of let. So now this is all about three different parts of let: hosting, redeclaration or reassignment, and scopes. Now we'll jump into the third point, like our third concepts, which is like const. Now what is const? As you know, const is also got presented in ES6. As the name suggests, const is used to declare constants, which means once you assign a value to a const variable, you cannot change it. Now this is one important point which you should remember: you cannot change the variable. But there is something that people often get confused, right? Const is the only immutable for variable assignment itself. If you are dealing with object or arrays, you can still modify the properties or elements inside them. That is one most important point for const, right? So now this you should always remember about const. Now we will go ahead and see the same thing for const also, how we declare the variables with const, right? Now let's take the same example that we have shown just a few minutes back. The variable declaration in terms of the scoping rules is almost similar, right? I have given you an example. Now I have rewritten that example with a const. The same example that I have shown, everything applies same, everything remains same in case of global. If I declare it outside, it also works fine, completely fine. Any place I declare and use it, I console.log, it works completely fine. But in case of local variable, the same applies which is for let. If I declare local variable here and I try to access it outside the block, it still gives me an error. Now inside one specific block, I have this variable declared. Now if I try to access this variable outside of its block, it will give me the same error. Now everything remains same with let, right? Now the next point is we have to see how we can redeclare and reassign variables declared with const. So I'll just comment it out, I'll just remove it. Okay. Now for const, let's see an example of declaration. Now I am declaring a variable with const number equals to 100, and then I'm again trying to declare num equals to, trying to reassign the variables as num equals to 190, and then I'm trying to do a console.log. Now what should be the output over here? Very basic, right? As the name suggests, const, it will be constant. So if I try to do this, it should ideally throw me an error, right? Assignment to a constant variable. I cannot reassign the same variable. It says it is a const. Yeah, and if I try to redeclare the same variable again, it should still throw me an error, right? If you see it again throws me an error. Cannot redeclare, right? Or num has already been declared. That kind of error I will get in the console. Now these are two important examples. Now one example, if I try to do something like this, const num, and I do num equals to 100, this I cannot do over here, right? Without declaring a variable, without assigning a variable, basically you cannot declare that variable in case of const. Now this is one of the important point that you have to remember. This example over here, now we have a primitive value which is 3.14. now I'm trying to do a console.log pi. Now if I try to reassign this pi to a different primitive value, this will not allow me to do that. So that is one important point which you should remember in case of const, in terms of the arrays and primitive data types and the objects. Now let's take an example of object. Now with this object, I have just given you the example beforehand so that I don't waste time while writing the example. Now beforehand, if you see, I have a person object, right? Now I'm doing a console.log person, and then I'm trying to modify the person.age. Now this is a property of an object, and this is allowed if you are using const. So this is one of the most confusing, and people will question you, drill down, dig you in this concept for const. This is a go-to question for any interview that you are attending, right? So please make sure you understand it. If you're not understanding, let me know in the comments. Now I am trying to do a console.log person. This is fully allowed, no error, nothing will happen in this case. Now if you want to add new properties, that also you can do with const. I'm trying to add a new property. This is completely fine in terms of the const, and it should work seamlessly. But if I try to reassign the object itself, let's say this person object, I'm trying to replace this person object with another set of object, right? Then it doesn't allow you to assign it, because assignment is prohibited in case of const. We cannot reassign it, right? Now same with an example. Let's see with an example of array how it works. I have an array and I am having a numbers. It prints the numbers, which is completely fine. Now in the next step, I'm trying to modify the element inside the array, which is completely permissible. I can still modify the elements of the array, but I cannot change the individual elements, right? Now if I try to change number 0 equals to 10, sorry, my bad, I can change the individual elements as well. Now but what I cannot do is I cannot reassign the entire array. If you see over here, this reassignment is not possible. Like, I hope you have got the gist. So in case of this const, I cannot reassign something. The base declaration, whatever I have, I cannot change the assignment. Like, I cannot change it to a completely new or different object. So this is how things works in case of const. Okay, now let's go to the hoisting concept. Now in case of const, variables which are declared with const, just like let, are hoisted at top of their global, local or block scope, but it does without a default initialization, where variables, as you have seen earlier, are hoisted with default value of undefined, so they can be accessed before declaration without any error. Now accessing a variable declared with const before the line of declaration will throw you cannot access variable before initialization error. Now let's see with an example. Now this is something, I'll just uncomment. Yeah, right, I have a const num equals to 100, and let me see if I try to access it before initialization. Console.log sorry, num, right? In this example, if you see, if I try to access it before initialization, let's see what it does. If you see, cannot access num before initialization. So this is one important comparison, because here if you see, num is globally scoped variable declared with const. By trying to access this variable before the line of declaration, we get cannot access num before initialization. The same error will occur if it was a locally scoped variable, right? Now this is one of the important point that you should remember. Now we will wrap up this with one simple step or one comparison. There is a comparison that I should tell you before summarizing everything. Like in case of where it's very much straightforward and we know it, but in case of let and const, both are blocked scope, meaning they are only accessible within the block they are declared in. The variables declared with let can be reassigned, while variables declared with const cannot be reassigned after the initial assignment. Now there is a concept of temporal dead zone. Both let and const are subjected to the temporal dead zone, which prevents accessing the variable before its declaration within the block, right? That is how the temporal dead zone works, right? Now if you see here, this starting block, and between this block I cannot access the variable. That is how the temporal dead zone works. That is what it is called as temporal dead zone. That is just a technical term to explain the concept of temporal dead zone. Now after this block and this declaration, I can able to access this variable. That is the concept of a temporal dead zone. So for both let and const, we will have a temporal dead zone, but in case of var, this is not true. Okay, so this is the point that you have to remember. Now in the next one, we'll deep dive into some of the interview questions that can come as a part of var, let and const. Maybe we'll dig down into a separate video after this. Please stay tuned and enjoy this series. Thank you so much.